right, everyone. Very, very luckily joined this morning. This afternoon for James, but this morning for us by one of the best journalists, in my opinion, Alex's opinion, in all of MMA, the great and powerful James Lynch. James, appreciate you giving us some time, man. So how are you doing this morning?
Doing very well after that intro. Thank you very much, guys. Thanks for having me on. And by the way, I got to tell your listeners that we've been trying to do this forever. Set up this me coming on the show, and I've been so busy. So thank you guys for being patient with me. Save the best for last. It all worked out well. So thanks for having me on, guys.
Of course, man. Patience is the key. So first question, James. I want to get straight into it. As you know, people who are in the space like ourselves and yourself. Fans as well. We're massive fans, and that's, I think, how everyone sort of comes into the sport. What originally drew you in and made you a fan? Was there a specific fight that sort of drew you in, or was it just the popularity of the sport?
It was actually season 1 of The Ultimate Fighter. I don't know what it was. I just sort of like remember flipping channels when I was in university, and I see this show where these two guys are fighting, and I'm like, what is this? And I don't know, that season for whatever reason hooked me, and I just became an immediate fan. And of course, at that time, Pride was still going on in Japan, and I remember watching some Pride fights as well. And so I'm what they used to call a tough noob, if you remember that back in the day. That's what I used to be called. So that's what initially got me in, and then I somehow figured out, years later, how to actually cover this sport. I mean, you want to be a fan, the best way to be a super fan is to cover this sport. So luckily, just quickly, I'll give you kind of the Coles notes. I went to school for broadcasting and journalism, and I wanted to cover hockey. That was sort of the main thing. But then once I fell in love with MMA, I took a sharp right, and here we are today. So it's been quite the journey.
For sure. So, James, something I really want to talk to you about is the grind of sort of MMA media and becoming a professional journalist, because as sort of everyone does when they first, start off, everyone's looking to just start getting interviews, start trying to build their own name on Instagram or YouTube as much as possible, doing all this while still having a day job or, just as you said, studying at university. What piece of advice would you give sort of guys that are just starting out that can maybe help them reach the level that you and other MMA journalists have reached where this becomes their full-time profession?
That's a great question. I do have a video on my channel which kind of talks about kind of the 5 best tips, but I'll kind of give you the summary of that, which is basically, be consistent. I think that's the big thing. I see a lot of people putting out content. Maybe they put out 4 interviews one week and then they disappear for a couple months. That's not the way to build a brand. Start off slow. Don't have your expectations realistic. I always tell people, do 1 piece of content a week. When I first started doing this as a freelancer, I had a full-time job. I was working 9 to 5. I would come home after my job, and then I think a couple days a week during the evenings, rather than going drinking with my buddies, I was doing interviews, so I sort of laid the foundation for where I'm at now. So I'd say consistency is a big one. 2 is don't just cover the UFC. I see a lot of people make this mistake. Obviously, if you're going to get UFC fighters, you're going to get more eyeballs. But the problem is there's so many people doing the same thing. If I interview a fighter, if you interview a fighter, if someone else interviews a fighter, a lot of people are not going to want to watch that interview because there's already 4 interviews of that same person. There's so much MMA that needs more coverage. Women's MMA, regional MMA. There's so many areas where you can kind of find that little, sort of pocket of a niche and sort of build your own brand that way. I think that's an easier way to stand out. It'll take you longer, but that's a big thing too. The third thing I would say is also just, find what you like doing. Try a bit of everything. Try play-by-play, writing. There's a lot of need for that. I talk to site managers all the time. Some of their best traffic is when people are doing play-by-play for like an LFA event or a Titan FC event, because there's just not enough coverage of that. Also, figure out, like I said, maybe you like doing on-camera interviews. Maybe you like doing, for example, for me, I like doing interviews on camera than I like doing writing. Now I can do both, but I definitely double down more on what I'm good at. So find what you're good at and, sort of run with it. The other thing that's really important is find people that do what you want to do well. Surround yourself with the people who actually know what they're talking about. I see this all the time. People go on social media and say, let me know what you think of this interview. Well, that really doesn't mean much because it's a bunch of people who don't pay your bills or are willing to pay for your content. Find the people who do. People in this industry are pretty accessible. Most people are easy to get a hold of. If there's someone you like and respect, definitely make sure that you're reaching out to them and getting them to look at your work and improving. I see a lot of people as well stuck in the same spot because they haven't improved, and there's sort of that ego part of it, but always be willing to learn. And I think that's it. Maybe I'm missing a few things, but those are kind of the basic things. Consistency, building a brand, finding what you're good at, improving. And I think you do all those things, you'll be in the right direction.
James, I want to sort of go away from MMA for just this 1 sec.
Sure.
Because I know you're a massive golf fan and you are a golfer. As well as me, I love golf. So as my old man, he's in his 50s, plays 4 or 5 rounds a week. Who is your favorite golfer at the moment? And do you have any thoughts, if any thoughts, on the new LIV tournament? Because I read an article yesterday announcing the Saudis have made this, 14 tournament series, and the winner gets $600 million, and it's like ridiculous. I mean, in my opinion, I think it's really interesting news. I just want to get your take as a golfer yourself.
Well, I should clarify. I'm like a casual golf fan. I actually don't watch a ton of it just because I'm so busy with MMA, but I do golf a lot. I'm not very good, believe it or not, even though I do play a lot. I still haven't gotten better, but no, I sort of like kind of keep tabs in it. You know, growing up, I was always a Greg Norman fan. You know, well before Tiger Woods, he was always sort of my guy. I just, you know, the shark and all that cool stuff. Big Greg Norman guy back in the day. But right now, I don't really have a favorite golfer. I just, you know, I sort of tune into the highlights when I can. And as far as the live golf thing, I think it's very interesting. You know, I do listen to sports talk radio all the time when I'm in my car, and you know, this thing's, it's kind of, you know, it's interesting because the PGA's never really had any competition. You look at over the years, and any professional sport they've had, you know, like with the NFL, they had, you know, the what was it, the AFL XFL. And all these other XFL. Well, XFL not so much, but you know, back you go back earlier, like in the 80s, they had what was the USFL, which was like supposed to be their competition, and then they ended up taking a lot of players from there. So I think the live golf thing is very interesting because, I mean, if you're willing to pay golfers more money, that's where, you know, people might jump ship and stuff. So I think it's, I listen, if people are going to get paid more, I'm all for that. But I also feel like, you know, PGA, there's some debt owed to that promotion as well. So it's getting very interesting in golf right now from a casual viewer's perspective.
100%.
Yeah, for sure. So circling back to MMA, James, one thing about covering MMA today is that our sport forgets so quickly about fighters and their contributions to the sport, whether it was a fighter's legendary run or a great performance. In your opinion, who is one fighter who has had a significant impact on the sport that is maybe forgotten about by some fighters? Because from my perspective, it's Ronda Rousey, because I think people look a lot at the later stage of her career and they sort of maybe overlook what she was able to bring and contribute to MMA in the early days.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Although you said forgotten, I'd say people probably still remember Ronda Rousey. Yeah. If you wanted to go like specifically forgotten, I don't know. I'm just trying to think. Maybe like a Hoist Gracie, believe it or not, because you just don't hear about Hoist these days, right? I mean, the newer fans, sure, they hear the Gracie name, but I don't know if they know the history. But Rousey's a great example. I'm glad you brought that up because I think one of the biggest what ifs in MMA was what if Ronda Rousey did not fight Amanda Nunes. I always wonder that because I really believe if she fought any other fighter on the roster, she probably wins. Yep. It's just the fact she fought someone in Nunes who was such an absolute killer at the time. And Rousey, one of the worst things that happened to her career was she fell in love with her stand-up after beating Betch Correia. And of course, that's not her bread and butter. Her bread and butter is her judo. And you know, I think people forget the run that she was on. Remember, there was that run where she beat, what was it, Alexis Davis and Sarah McMahon and all these fighters. And like, I think the total time was like 1 minute and 30 seconds or something. Yeah. It's funny because I think it speaks to the fandom of MMA because, you know, people say, oh, Rousey was overrated. Well, no, she wasn't. She was destroying her opponents. She had that Mike Tyson-esque thing. And let's also not forget the reason there's women in the UFC is because of Ronda Rousey, right? Like she had that big run in Strikeforce. So that was the first person that came to mind when you said that about, you know, not getting enough appreciation. That's a great example because, you know, fans are very, there's a lot of recency bias when it comes to MMA fans, I find.
James, I know as Alex and I ourselves, big, well, I don't know if you still are, but we were big wrestling fans, pro wrestling fans back in the day. And I think that's how a lot of us sort of get in the UFC. Are you still a fan these days? And does covering, you know, some aspect of the WWE ever interest you, similar to what, you know, like Ariel Helwani's doing? Because, you know, I think that's quite an interesting style where he does, you know, bring these guys in and does, you know, do like an interview style where it's not, you know, it's not kayfabe, it's, you know, all just how the actual selves.
So again, same thing with wrestling, probably like a casual fan, big wrestling fan though in the Attitude Era back in the day. I mean, I love that was like, and I think that's also what kind of got me into the UFC as well, because the Attitude Era did such a good job of building up specific characters. And you know, whether the UFC wants to admit it or not, they had characters. Like I remember watching Diego Sanchez, you know, this weird guy who was like, you know, doing all this different stuff. that, or like, I remember Chris Lieben that season, this guy with bright red hair and like had all these issues personally, and it was still knocking guys out like that. That's, I think what got me into it. I mean, you know, I was also a Bret Hart fan back in the day, being Canadian. I mean, I think it's mandatory if you live in Canada, you got to be a Bret Hart fan, right? So, I loved wrestling back in the day. I'll tell you guys what I do really love is like watching all the wrestling, like documentaries and stuff. You know, there's like Dark Side of the Ring, and there's the A&E series that I did. I'm all about that stuff because that was my, you know, teenage childhood years, right? Like that was awesome for me. So, from that perspective, love wrestling. As far as crossover, I'll tell you one thing. I'll end up doing someday, but I still follow hockey very extensively. extensively ice hockey, NHL here in North America. Huge hockey fan. I think if anything, that might be something I would do on top of doing MMA. Not much crossover there, although there is fighting in hockey, right? So there's that like little small part of it, but that's the sport that I'm really passionate about compared with MMA. Wrestling, not so much, but I got nothing against wrestling. I know there's some people who are anti pro wrestling. Those people, you don't need to hate on that. I have a lot of love for what the WWE's done over the years.
Yep, for sure. So, James, when we look at how far the UFC has come in the last 5 years alone, partnering with ESPN, back on ABC, can you see any more major hurdles getting in the way to stop the growth of the sport, which just seems to be exploding year upon year?
The only thing I'll say about that is I don't know if UFC will ever be mainstream. Like, I don't think it'll ever be to the point where like athletes are paid the same way that other professional sports are for two reasons. Number one, I think no matter what, there's going to be people who still think it's too violent. I just like, I see it all the time. I was mentioning I had a day job before. I remember for some reason there was UFC highlights on, and I remember one of my bosses, she walked by and said, "Oh, I don't know how people watch that stuff," not even knowing that I cover it on the side or anything. And I'm just like, are you kidding me? You watch football. It's just as violent. It's just they wear helmets. You don't see the damage the same way you see in other sports. So there's that side of it. I think that will always hold the UFC back. And then I'd say the other thing when it comes to the UFC, as far as them getting to the next level, is I just think that the way the model's set up, it's exactly set up like the WWE. It's the brand first, the athlete second. The UFC's created such a strong brand that there's really nowhere else to go. Yeah, you can go to Bellator and maybe you'll make some more money, but that's not the case with everyone who goes over there. Yeah, you can go to PFL and win $1 million, but I mean, how long is that going to last? Because I don't know. I mean, I just, as a guess, I don't think the PFL viewership and the money that they're making from that is going to last forever, right? They have deep pockets, but I just don't know how far the growth can go. So I think those two things are two big hurdles that will prevent the UFC from becoming like the other sports. But I mean, it'll get bigger, but I don't think it'll ever reach that point where we're talking about the UFC. We're talking about the same way that we talk about NFL football or anything like that.
James, obviously MMA is one of the most addicting sports, in my opinion, and I think in all of our opinions. Whenever there's a card on, we're sitting there ready to watch. We can't wait to watch it. But because it is such an addicting sport, it is also quite a brutal sport. Obviously we see fights like, Overeem and Ngannou, and you see the after shots, when they're on the ground. So what's the most difficult or say confronting aspect about covering the sport, and more so live, when you were at, international fight?
So yeah, sorry, you cut up a little bit there, but I kind of got the gist of what you're saying in that, how is it tough, covering that certain part? Absolutely. And I feel bad for fighters too, that, they lose a fight and they got to deal with all these morons online that, just want to tell them that, how they do so much better, or you lost me a bet. I mean, there's no sport like that really. I mean, obviously there's team sports, but I feel like UFC fighters get way more flack than other sports when it comes to criticisms and stuff. So I think that's difficult. There's the injury side of it. I mean, we know these guys are going to have long-term health issues. You just know it. It's not healthy getting hit in the head like that. So there's that side of it too. And there's just not a lot of money long-term for these guys. I mean, there's very few fighters that can turn into like a Cormier or Bisping or these guys that have found work in the broadcasting area. It doesn't end nicely like that. So I think that's part of it that's tough too. I mean, there's that moral, sort of ethical thing about covering the sport. But, at the same time, people choose to do this. No one's putting a gun to their head to take the sport as well. So it can be difficult. And you feel for the fighters. That's why I'll never, granted I cover the sport anyways, but I've never been the guy to say this guy sucks or whatever. To me, it's the hardest sport in the world to train for, to be a part of, and there's not a lot of payoff in the end either. Even fame wise, you look at a lot of the fighters, they're not that popular compared to other sports. So it's a really, really tough sport and brutal sport to be a part of.
Yep, for sure. So look, James, final question from us, and we really appreciate you giving us some time, as we know you're a busy guy, especially with the big UFC happening this weekend. And that leads into our final question. So we wanted to know, what's your prediction for the co-main and the main events? Because I think they both have the potential, especially that co-main, to be just an absolute barn burner of a fight.
Well, I realize the type of podcast I'm on here right now, and I'm sure you guys are pulling for your guy France, but I think Moreno wins the rematch. I think we'll start with the co-main event. To me, what it comes down to is his durability. Kai's been able to knock out a lot of his opponents. I know the last fight did go the distance, but I just think Moreno's durability. I like the fact that Moreno's working with James Krause now. I think we might even see a better fighter in the cage. And I thought he had a really close fight in his last one. I think you could have even argued that he won that last fight. To me, it's just that Moreno is fighting the better opposition. He does get hit a lot. There is a point point at some point where he is going to get knocked out. Maybe it's this fight, but I think the smart play here is I think Moreno wins the decision. I don't think he finishes Kai. I think Kai looks great. His stock goes up, if anything, has sort of one of those, all-out war fights, but doesn't end up getting the nod. It goes to Moreno. So that's the co-main event. Main event, I'm of the belief Amanda Nunes had an off night. I think Pena is a great fighter. All the credit to her for that first win. But I think people forget she got dominated in that first round. People always forget that. They talk about the fact that, Pena had her number. Well, she didn't in that first round. In fact, Nunes was close to finishing her. Yeah. I think Nunes, because of the fact that if you just look at the overall scope of her career, she does not gas ever. I mean, that happened in that fight. I think COVID had something to do with that. I think also apparently there's some injuries. I think she goes out there, looks great. I think she's a little bit more cautious this time, though. I don't think she goes for the kill in the first round. I could see Nunes winning a decision here for that exact reason, where she plays it smart and just gets the belt back and just, plays a smart game plan here. But I like Nunes and I like Moreno. Hate to pick two favorites and be boring here, but that's the way I'm going.
James, appreciate you giving us some time, man. I know we've been trying to do this for a while, so to finally do it and set it up, man, it's been awesome to get you on, and we'd love to have you on in the future. We really wish you all the best, my man.
Well, second off, third off, I don't know how many offs we've been here, but no, thank you guys for having me on. Honestly, I know it's been tough trying to schedule it. We'll definitely do this sooner than last time when we actually initially talked. So we'll definitely make it happen. Your listeners can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, at Lynch on Sports. That's LYNCH. Same thing with YouTube. I'm putting all my content on there. I do work for a lot of outlets, but you can always find my stuff in playlists. That's youtube.com/Lynch on Sports. And thank you guys so much for having me on. It was awesome. More than happy to come on again, and we'll make it happen. Like we did this time.
Awesome. Thank you, man.
Awesome. Thanks, man.